welcome back. We're into the third stage of building this oven. By now we have a magnificent beast that looks very much like a pizza oven, so give yourself a pat on the back. I have taken the plastic wrapping off, that comes off very easily. I've also pulled the cardboard structure out from inside the oven. Probably don't need to go too much into how to destroy things, most people are pretty good at that, but a good idea is to try and reach in and pull the centre supports out of the cardboard structure when you're removing it. So pull all the centre supports out and then the outside will just pull down quite easily. So you're left with a smart pizza oven. Now we are going to move on and install the flue. So this is the starter ring for the flue. Now hopefully you've got it as sort of level as possible. It just makes fitting the flue a lot easier now. You'll see on your flue that there's actually a join. So when they cut it and then roll it to actually create the flue, they create a join here. So we don't want that towards the front or side or anything, so make sure that is facing the back. Now it slots into the starter ring and wiggles down. So most often you'll find it doesn't go all the way down to this lip. It's just sort of a retaining lip there on the flue. So don't expect it to go all the way down. It's most important that we get this vertical. Okay, so we want to now go through with a level and just measure from the back and the sides. When we adjust one side, we recheck the other side. So we're just going to take a minute to do that. So taking a level, this is a 600mm level. We can see there's a fair bit of movement in that flue. We can just put it on the side and get that bubble nicely in the middle of the two lines there. And then we can check this side, and I can see it just needs to move over a bit. And I'm there, and then I recheck this side, and I'm pretty happy with that position there. I don't want to give it too much because you can get a lot of leverage when you're pulling across here, so don't squish it down too hard before you're making the adjustments, and then just give it a little bit of a wiggle down to make sure it's in place. But what you don't want to do is haul it because you can break off your arch and do all sorts of damage. So that is now in place. We're going to recheck it after we've done our insulation and before we put our last coat of mortar on, but it's nice to have to know that it is reasonably well in place. So if you're running just the single flue system, then you can cut ahead of the video now and go straight to the insulation. We're just going to cover off doing the double flue system. So the system whereby we put the 200mm flue on the outside there, just to alleviate some of the heat pressure and expansion pressure from the stainless. So if you've chosen to go for the additional 200mm flue, which sits around the outside of this 150mm flue, we're going to look at that now. So what we're looking to do is create a buffer zone between the inside and the outside flue. Now when this flue superheats, it expands, so metal expands, and it expands at a different rate to the mortar around it. So if you're not quite careful or it gets too hot, it can actually crack the mortar around it. So we're trying to alleviate that with the secondary flue. You've also got the issue that if you heat up the concrete or the mortar around the flue and there's a bit of residual moisture in there, it can actually cause that to boil and turn to steam and expand and crack. So we're looking to avoid that. So we're now going to place the 200mm flue over the top of this one and just sit in place. Now I'm making sure I have my seam at the back there, so let's turn it around so it's facing directly at the back, so it's not seen from the side or the front. And then I'm going to run a series of packers. So in your pack you're going to have 8 of these high temperature packers. Now they're 20mm by 25mm, so they allow you a little bit of variance to pop them in. Now we're going to drop 4 straight down on each quarter, so they're just going to pop down and land down the bottom here, and they'll sit against the concrete. They'll be there forever, but they'll just create or make sure that gap stays about 20-25mm between the two flues. And then I'm just going to pack them in the top between the two flues, just sort of pack them into place so that everything is suspended nicely between the two, and these stay in there forever, so they're not affected by heat. So you can see I'm literally just dropping them down there and probably can't get a good look at what's happening down there, but essentially I've got one on each side, creating a bit of a uneven spacing. And then I will now pack one here, one here, one here, one here. So with that little job done, I'm now going to gently check the levels on this. Now, I'm not looking for it to be dead accurate at this stage. We're going to get into that when we put the mortar on, but just go around and check one side and the other side. And if you make an adjustment, just check the other side. So that is roughly in place. That is pretty much ready to go. We are going to move on to insulation now. Right, it is time to jump in and insulate this oven. So we are going to put on 2 layers of 25mm ceramic fibre insulation. So it's a real high-tech insulation. It's going to serve 2 purposes. First and foremost, to keep the heat inside the oven. So when this gets super hot, we want to retain the heat in it. And secondly, to protect the outside layers from getting too hot. So you don't want your standard mortar layers getting too hot or outside paint and that sort of thing. So it serves 2 purposes there. Now, before we go ahead and do our insulation, you're going to see in your pack a series of screws. And what we need to do is just go around and in each side of the hexagon put in 2 screws. So they're about 50mm or so from the edge. It really doesn't matter, it's only a loose thing. And you leave them about 25mm proud, so don't put them all the way in. We're going to come back later and attach our wire mesh to them that goes over the top of the insulation. So we want to have them in place first before we do our insulation. We need to start measuring our insulation, and to do that we are going to use string instead of a tape measure. If we try and use a tape measure on a curved surface, it's just hopeless. It just keeps sort of cracking up on funny angles and we can't get it accurate. So we want to get our cuts of insulation as accurate as possible, because the fewer gaps we have, the fewer weak points there are in the insulation. So using a piece of string, old technology, we can just roll it over the oven. So our first cut is going to be right the way over the oven. We're going to cover the whole thing. We're going to do one coat of insulation that way, and another layer of insulation, I should say, and another layer of insulation this way. So it crosses over and covers any of the gaps and joins that we have in the insulation. To measure the insulation, we're going to take the string from halfway down the insulation on that side, over the top of the dome, all the way down, and then I'm just going to pinch my thumb and finger around the string halfway down the insulation on the other side. And then I'm going to add 30mm on to allow for the outside of the insulation to go right over as well. So just to make it a little bit longer. Now I'm going to transfer this mark onto the insulation. You can use a little pen or something to mark the string, but later on you'll find when you've done a few measurements it can get quite confusing. So best thing is just to clamp on like that and go out to wherever you're cutting the insulation and transfer that on. Now in terms of cutting the ceramic fibre insulation, it's a really easy material to work with. You basically just need a sharp knife. So very straightforward. I prefer one with a longer blade, but it is only 25mm thick, so a shorter one's fine. The material itself can be a little bit of an irritant. It's a bit like glass insulation bats and that sort of thing. So you want to make sure as a minimum you wear a dust mask. I prefer to wear overalls or older clothing, something I can take off when I've finished the job and wash separately. So don't wash it with everything else in the house, just wash it separately. So that takes care of the irritant issue. If you are particularly susceptible, you can wear gloves and just tuck your coveralls or overalls into the base of the glove, and that will stop any of the fibres getting in there. But you'll find it's actually a very good material to work with, and I don't have too much problem with irritation. It's just very person specific. So I'm going to go now and cut my piece of insulation over the top here, and then we'll come back, lay that on, and we'll start working on the flue area over here. So let's get stuck into that. I've gone ahead and cut my insulation to the length on the string, and it's resting on the 2 screws on that side and goes across and rests on the 2 screws on this side. Now just recapping on the health and safety of the stuff, if you do have any concerns, there's actually some really good reading on this sort of material on the WorkSafe New Zealand website, so recommend that if you are curious or you want to know a bit more. Before we go too much further, once we have an idea of where the insulation is going to be sitting, what we're going to do is just drill two 5mm holes in the outer casing only of this flue. Now just start with a 2 or 3mm drill and then work your way to a 5mm drill, because it just makes it a little bit easier in the stainless. It's very easy drilling, it's not too hard at all, but it's quite a thin material. But what that does is they will just act as a little bit of a pressure release. If we get a bit of moisture in the insulation blanket and we crank the fire up and things start to really heat up in there, sometimes that trapped moisture can create some pressure and create a crack in the oven where we don't want it to be. So those two holes there are just in case there is some pressure build up within the insulation, they can release a bit of pressure out of there. So once they're drilled, we forget about it. They only go through the outer casing here, don't go through the inner one. And there's going to be insulation material sitting down in there anyway. I'm now going to go in and start forming the shape around the flue gallery here. So this is where you need to decide what shape oven you really want. You can ramp one up quite high or keep it quite low, so just a personal preference thing. But we're going to use the insulation to do a lot of the shaping. So rather than use a huge amount of mortar later on and try and build your mortar up that thick, we use the insulation to shape it. So the first part of that is to wrap insulation around the flue here. So on one of my builds I'll typically go say 200mm high, which will allow for a little bit of a ramp up, not too much, but you can go higher or a little bit lower, give you a sort of flatter look on the oven. Just depends on your personal preference. When you measure this, and some of the mathematicians out there will be able to solve this for me, but obviously using the string again, not a tape measure, and you measure it out, you'll need to cut the insulation 70mm longer than this actual measurement. So 70mm, so it's quite a bit. And it basically allows the insulation to come around and touch each other there. So I've gone ahead and cut some of that, and I'm going to pop that on now. And what I'm going to do is just wrap that all around the flue, and you'll see it tidies up and touches nicely on the side. So I'll push it all the way down to the mortar there and wrap that up. Now in your pack you will see that there is a length of this wire. Now this is designed to wrap around and around this insulation to hold it in place. You need to just tie a loop in the end. I was obviously a good Boy Scout, but I tied a bow line there. You can just tie a double granny if you want, doesn't really matter, it only needs to serve a purpose while all the insulation goes on and then the mortar goes on. So feed that through the loop. Pull it back on itself, and then you can sort of hold it in place and wrap it round. Just watch your eyes when you do this. Probably should be wearing safety glasses. Wrap it round, and then you can just sort of hook it back onto itself. It doesn't need to be anything flash at all, just sort of wind it round. And you'll find that just holds it neatly in place so it doesn't flap everywhere. And now we're going to build our insulation up the sides here. Next part of the process is you'll see that obviously there's a bit of a gap under the blanket there. So just start in the middle and cut your way down, and we're going to cut some little wedges out, because as you push it down the pieces are going to come together and you will see that they overlap. So what we want to do is cut out that overlap so that the material sits down nice and flat and follows the curve of the oven. So we can just work our way along here. Start your cut where you can see it's actually okay up there. Lift it up, and that will give you an idea of the amount to cut off. Doesn't matter if your knife runs along the oven here, that's concrete, that's only gonna sharpen your knife. Just work your way down, overlapping, cutting those wedges out. And you'll find it all starts to sit down very nicely. Now if you cut a little bit out, too much out like that, just peel some off and poke it in the hole there. So that is all good. So I'll just work my way over the oven. so I have a nice tight fit, and I'll do the same on the other side there. Rather than have you watch me do the whole thing, I'll just show you the next steps. So we want to basically wrap insulation up here. We want our insulation to come to about 50 mil back from these front bricks. So we're going to run the insulation up, and we're going to wrap more insulation around here, get this all looking nice and snug. We'll cut a piece around the back, once again using the string. Just hold it on the insulation there and hold it round to there, and then cut to the length of string. Hold the piece you've cut against here, it'll be quite big, and then cut round that curve to follow this piece here. So we'll jump back on soon when I'm doing that to give you a bit of a better idea, but I'll add some more pieces to the puzzle and then come back and we'll talk about that. Okay, I am back and I've added a few different parts on, as you will see at the front there. Now this part is one of the trickiest cuts in actually getting this insulation right, so I just thought I'd take you through it. So if you've got your insulation pretty much sitting on top of those screws down there, and you're holding it against the other insulation that's already there, rather than cutting into it that way, cut it down that way on like a bit of an angle so that your knife is straight up and down, because that will mean when it links up to the other insulation it will sit flush against it. So you can just gently work your way around, so cutting on that angle, and check as you go. So cut all the way through and check as you go that it's sitting nicely against the other insulation. Have a sort of look we need to cut, and cut. And you'll see that will now sit nicely against the other insulation that's there. Now don't be worried about offcuts and things like that. We are going to use everything. So if you get a bit of a gap or a hole, let's say I had that hole there or something like that, I can take this and jam it in there. So it's not an exact science. We just want to make sure it's all covered as much as possible and you can't see any of the mortar underneath. So you'll see it's too long here on the corners, so I'm just going to line up halfway along or halfway up my insulation there, and I'm going to cut along there and remove that piece so that it's all sitting down at the right level. Now up the front here I have added these bits of insulation. Remember we're hanging it back here from the front and it's sitting nice and snug here. Now we've got little holes and things here, so just get insulation, jam it in all the way around there. Because eliminating gaps is so important on this sort of insulation, what I just want you to do is just take some of the insulation offcuts you've got and rip them into quarters so that you've got some strips here. Tear it up, doesn't matter if they peel off, and where you see a join like that, just stretch it over like a bit of velcro and sort of push it down. So stretch it over, push it down, and we can work our way along this join that we've created here, just working it over, pushing it down so it's firmly in place. Any little offcuts, just going along. And we just want to be thin at this stage. We don't want to waste a whole lot of material because we've got lots of other, or another layer to go on top. So just rip it out, pack it together, stick it down. Real easy way of just tidying up the gaps and holding it all in place. So we know when we put the second sheet on, we're not going to run into any dramas with regards to the insulation moving underneath and that sort of thing. So I'm just going to go over the oven and do that now. Any of these pieces that are sitting out, don't be too worried about it, the fact that that's sitting out there, because we're going to get, after the next layer of insulation, we're going to put some foil and then we're going to run some plastering mesh. So the plastering mesh is going to hook onto those screws that we put in earlier and we can pull it in nice and tight. So all these edges are going to sit in nice and tight, so don't be worried about that. Probably as good a time as any to cover off why we're actually leaving a gap under here. It's so we can get our wire onto those screws, but it's also so we can jam a bit of waterproofing mortar underneath. So the next layer of mortar is going to be a waterproofing mortar, and so we can sort of squish it underneath, and that'll just give us an extra thick layer of defence there from water and moisture ingress. So yeah, I'm going to jump in and do that now, and I'll see you again very soon. Now if you have any problem at all with this back piece falling down, or perhaps you can't get a gap closed or something like that, just use some small pieces of wire. So I'll just hold that up there. So this is just a real bendable wire. You bend one side one way and then the other side at a 90-degree to it. So what will happen is, because that's curved down slightly, we'll hook into the insulation, and then the other side can come across and push in like that, and it sort of locks it down. So you can see I've just put one in here just to sort of stitch up this joint here, stop it slumping down, because last thing we want to do is put this on and then see that it's slumped. We don't want any gaps in there at all. So just a little hit, you can use one of those for that. Now I have cut this piece, so that's our next piece to be formed. Because I need to shape this as well, it's not just, I can't just push it down. I just need to make some small cuts. Make sure you don't cut the insulation underneath. So when we're cutting out those small wedges, make sure you don't cut the insulation underneath, because we don't want to have to do any repairing on that. So I'm going to do that piece there, and then I'm going to run these pieces around both sides. So I'll go ahead and do that now and rejoin you in a minute. So we're in the future, and I have cut this piece. So I've made a couple of cuts. On this one here, I only needed to make 2 cuts to make it fold down nicely. On the other side, I made 3. So just a judgment call on how to get this insulation sitting down nicely. I put this one continuous piece on, but the other piece, the other side over here, actually has 3 pieces. So just because of the roll length, I didn't have one continuous piece left as it was, but do them in as big a piece as you can. You find it sits up quite well because it sticks to the insulation behind it. But now that we've got it looking pretty good, we once again want to go through, just using some offcuts, rip up those quarters, slap them on. So keep them nice and thin. So we don't want to go halves or anything like that, because that'll start changing the shape of the oven. So that one needs to come down, go over. Just do that all over the oven. Once again, if it's not sitting up properly, not playing ball, then just use some little wire ties to alleviate that. And you'll see, look, a little billowing out here and stuff like that. Don't worry about it. As I said before, a little wire is going to pull all that in. What you need to do now is just concentrate on the shape that you want around here. So we've got a little bit of work to do. We've got lots of little offcuts, so you can sort of decide on the shape of your oven. Now, you can just pack all sorts of different offcuts into the space. Just hand tear the stuff, because it doesn't matter how thick the insulation is, because obviously it'll just work better and better. It's more important that we're not having to do a huge amount of plastering work, and that we use up all these scraps that we've got sitting around to actually build up the shape that we want. So you can strip stuff down and pack it in. But when we put the plastering mesh on, it's going to sit in some places just off the insulation. So we don't need the insulation rock solid. That's not what's holding the plaster in place. It's actually the plastering mesh, which is why we put that on there. So when we build our mesh up around and then we put our plaster over the top, it's actually the plaster working and holding onto the mesh that makes the shape. It doesn't matter about the insulation. So I'm just going to take a bit of time to get the general shape of what I want. There you are, your very own patchwork quilt. So look, I have used up every single little bit of insulation. I have had these little rectangles, I've torn them into quarters and just placed them over things. I've made sure the joins of my insulation are covered, and I've made sure whatever I've done to one side of the oven, I've done to the other, because the last thing you want is a lopsided oven. We are going to follow fairly evenly with the plaster, so make sure if you do it to that side, do it to that side. Just do a bit of a reality check. So step back from the oven, make sure it looks reasonably similar on both sides. You can see here I've packed in a good amount of insulation, so my mortar is going to come along and probably finish up at about that sort of height there, but it'll give us a nice little sort of curve up there, a nice shape to the oven. So that's the insulation done. Now we're going to move on and cover this with aluminium foil. There's not a lot of technique to that. what you can do is just tuck the aluminium foil underneath here to help hold it in place. It is a bit of a painful process if it's windy, so if it is windy you can use a bit of tape on it because we're north of the insulation now, so this part's only going to get to sort of 50 or 60 degrees, so it's pretty safe in that perspective. I'm going to jump in and do the foil, and I'll see you again soon. I have now completed my giant Easter egg. So I've wrapped it all in foil. I've tucked the foil in here to hold it in place, tucked it under that front lip there, tucked it underneath the bottom of the insulation. So as long as it's all neat and tidy, it doesn't matter which direction it's run at. It just needs to be neat and tidy with complete coverage. Next part of the operation is to jump into the mesh, which is pretty exciting because we get to use an angle grinder, which is really cool. It's at this point you'll understand why we put those screws in the insulation board before we put the top insulation layer on. They can be a little bit hard to locate now, but we are going to need to find them because we're going to hook our mesh onto it as we work our way around. I'm going to cut the mesh now, so it's ready to go, and we're going to jump in, use an angle grinder to slice down and make our various cuts in the mesh so that they fold down neatly over this structure. We're going to jump in now and do the mesh. Now this mesh is actually a plasterer's mesh, so it's not chicken netting or something simple like that. It's actually designed for plaster, and that's where the strength of the system will come from. So our plaster is actually going to be laid over this and through this, and the steel in the mesh will actually reinforce the plaster, and that'll give us the shape that we require for the oven as well. So I've taken a length. It'll be slightly longer, the piece that you get in your pack, than the oven if you wrap it all the way around. This is an easier process with two people because otherwise it sort of flaps around the place. So if you can get another person to just hold one end and wrap it around. The way I've done this is I secured it here, and then I gently wrapped it all the way around the oven, and then I just worked my way around, hooking the mesh onto those fasteners that we screwed into the insulation board underneath. So the net result is that the mesh itself actually starts to want to become round, which will give us the better curves for the oven, and it's tucked up underneath the insulation there and hooked up on those screws. So a very simple process. To say a little bit easier with two people. Be very careful of these edges, so they're quite sharp. Recommend you wear eyewear and definitely gloves, otherwise you'll be leaking it over the place. And start in one part and work your way all the way around to the other side. Now once it's like this, this is the cool part. We are now going to use an angle grinder to cut it. So look, if you don't want to use an angle grinder and you're not that confident with them, then just use a pair of cutters, but it's a bit of a laborious task to cut and make a whole lot of strips with a pair of hand pliers. So one of these puppies makes it a lot easier. Definitely wear eyewear, definitely wear gloves, and of course hearing protection. Right, now as you can see, that process is a bit of a mongrel. It's certainly if you've got a full face mask, definitely wear that, and to be honest, you kind of do it at your own risk. But if you are nervous about it, you start and you think, oh, this isn't for me, then you can go through with a pair of side cutters like that and just snip on the way down. It's another 15 minutes. So better to be safe than sorry. If you're not 100% confident and you're happy doing it, then obviously go with the side cutters. Now I was just making my way around, cutting at roughly 250mm increments on my way around, and I was cutting down to about where I could see the mesh sitting flush with the aluminium. So kind of a judgment call there. This one's about 300mm up, and you can see it'll sit down fairly nicely on against the aluminium tin foil. So once I've made those cuts, I'm going through with cable ties. And I've already done some cable ties, might be a little bit hard to see, they're clear. And these are just when you lay the pieces down, so when you lay the strips of the mesh down, you can just secure them up with a cable tie. And then you can pull them up tight. And you pull them together, and that will allow the mesh to sit down nice and flat. So you can see here, I've cranked this cable tie up and it's sort of pulled into the shape that I want, because I want to keep this concave going in here. So I can sort of work my way up and just add cable ties, pulling it together and zipping it up so that they're sitting nice and flush with the aluminium there. I'm going to work my way around all the mesh so it's sitting down nicely. I'm going to cut a piece for the front as well, which I will show you a picture of so you get an idea. You want to take your mesh right up to the top and fold it in over the top of this lip of insulation towards the flue, so that when we put the plaster on this top bit, it's got something to adhere to too. So I just trim those up with the angle grinder, and I will cut a piece for the front section here, as I said, which I'll show you. So this is just a quick look at the front area. I have cut a piece that I've shaped it around here. If you want a squarer front look, you can just sort of pinch the wire so you get a square form to go around. I have tucked the mesh down into and beside the flue here, and I've also placed another piece across the back here, so I wanted to support that little arch coming up. Now it's also important that you go around the front and just tuck the mesh down against the brick. Now make sure you've maintained your 50mm here, because we're about to fill most of that up with the waterproof plaster that we're going to put on. Across the oven, you'll see these little tabs sticking up from your cable ties. You need to go and cut those off. It's a 2-minute job. Now it's important to get everything as nice and flush as possible. The better shaped it is with the mesh, the easier it is to do the plastering job. So that's part of the trick. So make sure it's all sitting down nicely. Don't rely on the weight of the plaster, because the mesh has a habit of lifting as you go, and it causes us a bit of grief. So yeah, just take the time, really work it down with those cable ties and get the shape of the oven going the way you want it.